All right, so my talk is called From Developer to Ally. And it's essentially, it's like an introduction to accessibility for developers, for people that are already web developers. So just a little bit about me. I'm John Cooperman. I'm a software engineer at Twitter. You can find me online at jcoop, most things like Twitter and GitHub. And I love talking about accessibility, so feel free to follow me or message me on there, and I'd love to talk. So what is accessibility? From the W3 specification, it mentions that web accessibility means that people with disabilities can use the web. And I like this definition okay, except it's a little bit ambiguous over the word disability and then also the phrasing of can use the web. What does it really mean to use the web? And so they have an addendum that I actually really like, which is that more specifically, web accessibility means that people with disabilities can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, and that they can contribute to the web. And that last part's kind of my favorite. I like the idea of building websites that aren't just passable or usable for people with disabilities, but are so good and enjoyable that people can not only interact with them, but contribute to them, because that's really what the web's all about. So a little bit about me and my story. I was learning web development a few years ago, and I didn't have any school or classical training or anything like that, so my sole source of information was Chris Coyer's CSS tricks. Is anybody familiar with the site? Awesome, okay. It's a great resource, it's amazing. Okay, so he's got all these videos and he's got guest authors come on, he's got all these blog posts and great, fantastic stuff. And so I had never really heard the term accessibility before, but I did hear that he kept mentioning whenever you'd put an image in a video or on a blog post, you'd say, and make sure you use really good alt text here for screen readers. And a while later, we're reading something else. Oh, and make sure you use really good alt text. You gotta think about screen readers. And so I had no idea what a screen reader was, but this message kind of was ingrained into my head that you have to have good alt text for screen readers. So my embarrassing confession is I guess I made up what a screen reader was in my head, and I thought that they were kind of like a Kindle, but like a cheaper version of a Kindle. And then it went even further than that, where I thought that the reason you needed alt text is because these cheap Kindles couldn't display images. And so there were some people out there on a device that I had never seen before in my entire life reading my blog post, and they'd be like, oh, it's a giraffe, great, and move on. And that's really what I thought I was doing. So that's embarrassing for me, but the kind of reason for the confession is that kind of like what Jennison was mentioning earlier, that so many people, so many developers don't know what web accessibility is or how to get started or things like that. And I want to really encourage people, especially developers, to not feel embarrassed, to ask those questions, to look up some very introductory things, because we all have to start somewhere with it. Flash forward a few years, I'm working at Twitter, and my team is assigned this task where we're taking twitter.com, the logged out page where where you go to sign in, and we're moving it over to our platform. And so we rebuild this page, and we do a couple of visual diff checks, make sure it looks pixel for pixel the same, and we run all the automated tests to make sure it functions more or less the same. And then my friend and I, we get this kind of idea where well, one thing that would be cool to do is we should diff the HTML. We should see if our dynamic code is generating the exact same markup that the previous one was. And so we diff the HTML and we see red everywhere. We're like, oh, what is going on? And so we see all of this, oh, sorry, here's the logged in page. We see all of this code that's got this stuff all over it, ARIA hidden, ARIA labeled by, all these different things that I had never heard of what they were before. So I go onto Google and I look them up, and I see ARIA labeled under accessibility. So I went to our accessibility lead at Twitter, and I kind of asked him about it, and that's really where I got my start, being really passionate and trying to learn as much as I can about it. So I was even full-time professional career working, had no idea what these ARIA things were, and Victor's going to come on after me and give you a whole bunch of information about ARIA, but again, kind of driving the point home that you got to start learning somewhere, and a lot of people just don't know this stuff. So back to this ambiguous word of disabilities. Johns Hopkins University published a list of disabilities, and I think it's really helpful to read through, because as you can kind of hear these disabilities as I read through them, you can start thinking about the challenges that people probably face when they're interacting with your website or application. So there's attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, blindness or low vision, brain injuries, deaf, hard of hearing, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, and then speech and language disabilities. And so I think you can really start thinking about things that might pose different challenges for different users with different disabilities, and kind of getting a big picture of what best practices might be as we kind of continue with this talk. So with all these different people out there and all these different challenges, there's so many different ways people browse the web, and there's so many different input devices people use to browse your websites or applications. So I'd like to go through these two, just a little bit, giving you some perspective. Maybe you can think about your own websites or apps and what they might be easy or maybe difficult to use with these types of devices. So a really common one is keyboard only. The web was designed originally to work very well keyboard only, no mouse, whether it's a lack of motor control or just personal preference or any number of reasons. So like the kind of first challenge that I would push on all of you is think about the sites that you own or maintain, and can they not only be accessed with just a keyboard, but can you do the really crucial things? Can you sign up for a new account? Can you cancel your account, change your settings, follow people? I don't know what kind of sites you own, but can you do all of those important business logic pieces with just a keyboard? There's also head wands and mouth sticks. These are very similar devices with people that don't have a lot of motor control. So it's essentially simulating like one finger that they could use to interact with the keyboard or even a touch screen. And so again, you can kind of start thinking, okay, let's say you pass the first test and your site is totally accessible with just a keyboard. How many clicks are we talking? Like how many tabs does it take to get into that sign up form? And if somebody's using a tool like this, how difficult is that going to be for them to do maybe 30 clicks on the keyboard to get in? And then single switch is like one of the coolest pieces of technology that I've ever seen. It's really just a button, just a single switch. It just has an on state and an off state. There's no hitting it at the side or anything like that. And so what happens is if you're on an iPad, let's say, with this plugged in, you'd pop it once, and the keyboard would come up, and it's going to start highlighting rows of the keyboard going down. And when you get to the row that you're interested in, you pop it again, and it swivels to a horizontal thing, now highlighting characters. When you get to the character you want, you pop it a third time, it enters the character. So we're kind of building on the same themes here. Like, how difficult is it going to be to use your website or application if a user is using a single switch, keyboard only, a head wand, something like that. And then lastly, what screen readers actually are, typically operating system level, a non-visual way to interact with multiple applications, but for the sake of this talk, websites. So this isn't specific to something like Chrome or Mozilla. It would be like Mac has VoiceOver as an application. Don't do it right now, but at any time not during my talk, hit Command F5, and it'll start the VoiceOver, the screen reader, and it can work with all of your apps, including the web. So supporting all of these users requires a couple of things. I've kind of broken it into 4 categories. One, back to Chris Coyer's sage advice, always use really good alternate text on those images. 2, use semantic markup. We have HTML5 now. There's no need for what they call div soup, where you just got divs everywhere for every single element. Screen readers don't know what to do with that. So using semantic markup, you can give screen readers a lot of context clues, like this is navigation, or a footer, or a header, or a sidebar. Things like that are great. They're great for your performance, your ranking in the search engines. They're great for accessibility. It's just an all-around win. ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, that's the topic of Victor's talk, and he's going to let you know a lot of great things about it. And then lastly, keyboard shortcuts, which can be a great way to deal with that potential frustration we were talking about how hard is it to get to that form or follow that user or change something in your profile. So keyboard shortcuts. If you go to a lot of the big sites these days, you'll notice that they have these like really incredible keyboard shortcuts, really well thought out, really well engineered, and really, really good working keyboard shortcuts. So for example, if you go to twitter.com and you hit Shift ? You get this nice modal that pops up. I'm not sure who can see that, but it basically is 1, 2 at the most key presses away from almost any interaction you could ever want to do on Twitter. So it's like go home, go to notifications, next tweet, new tweet, favorite, reply. You can really do everything from 1 or 2 key presses. Similarly, you go to Facebook and you type on their cog for help and you type keyboard shortcuts and you get this great list. It's like the same things. You can do everything you would want to do on Facebook, 1 or 2 clicks at the most. So I started looking at all these and all these great websites and all these great keyboard shortcuts because I realized not everyone has time to build a keyboard shortcut library. And I realized that they follow a lot of very similar trends. And before I scare you off, a lot of those trends are Vim bindings. They really stick to be like J is next item, K is previous item. This isn't a Vim talk, don't worry about it at all. It's just something that I noticed along the way, / is search. So I built this little open source thing called Shortcut.js. Feel free to use it. It's just MIT. It's like 30 lines of vanilla JavaScript. But basically, it listens on all these very common Vim bindings, and then it throws these generic JavaScript events, like shortcut next item, shortcut previous item. Then it would be up to you to write the business-specific logic for what a next item or previous item does, but it might be a really great starting ground. So you can find that on my GitHub. All right, so as developers, and presumably developers that already have sites that have been built, that are in production, things like that, I wanted to show you a bunch of really great tools that you can use to profile your website for accessibility flaws. And this is a lot of tools, but there's a lot of overlap here. So some of them are browser extensions, some of them are command line tools, things like that. I just kind of wanted to show you all what's out there, whatever strikes your fancy. My number one favorite one is Chrome's Accessibility Developer Tools. It's a Chrome extension. It sits right in on your Inspect element under a tab called Audit. And then it can do a full audit of any website that you're on. So it's really great. So I have this blog that I started like some number of years ago and have unfortunately ignored called Code Planet. So I went to Code Planet. It's just like this WordPress install that I haven't done much with. And I ran an audit on it. And I hope you can see there's like some red, some yellow, and some green. So there's some things I'm doing really wrong there. And then if I zoom in on it, it says like the things I'm doing wrong, I've got these two text areas that don't have labels. This gets back into letting screen readers and assistive devices help understand what's going on. So there's like two things here. Like one, I want to point out how easy it is to grab one Chrome extension and audit your app, right? That would take like a few minutes. And two, when we talk about accessibility from a developer standpoint, this isn't learning a new JavaScript framework. This isn't like, introduction to Haskell. Like this is like, these are like 1-point Jira tickets that you can put in and get done right away, and they make such a huge difference on your users. So we're really talking about adding 2 label tags around these 2 text areas that we have here. We're talking about contrast ratios on buttons. Look at the button, like, is it gray on gray? Maybe make it black on gray, something like that. These are really easy fixes from the developer side. I just kind of wanted to drive that home. Another great resource is tenon.io. It's just a website. You can put your URL in, and it does this full profile for accessibility stuff. It catches some stuff that's really interesting that the Chrome tool doesn't, like it found some empty paragraph tags. But again, it gets back to these same overlap. That form element has no label. So you can kind of see as these go together. Tenon also has an API, which is pretty cool, so you can send out your website, get it back, and then you can start incorporating accessibility into your automated testing flow, which is really important. Firefox has some really cool ones. There's the accessibility evaluation toolbar. This one's really interesting because it doesn't just show those surface level things, it actually dives into a lot of the accessibility specs. So I got some things that I actually wasn't familiar with on here, like the words contained in each H1 element should match a subset of the words contained in the title. I'm not sure what that is. I got to go back and look into that. But this one's pretty interesting because it dives deeper than most. It also Wave toolbar. It's an experimental, like in beta Firefox extension right now, but it's produced by WebAIM, which is a fantastic resource for accessibility, webaim.org. Theirs is kind of cool because it blows up your site. Like here's my Code Planet site, right? And it just throws all these tags all over, like green for things you're doing well, yellow for alerts, and then red for errors. And so I can see right here that I've got like, I'm doing some tricky CSS stuff that's not going to work well on assistive technologies. This is a different perspective on it. Instead of looking at the markup and making sure it's accessible, it's also important to remember that your color palettes are accessible. So this is by NC State University. I use this before every business card, web design, presentation I do. You put your hex codes in here. You pick a level of conformance, which I always pick AA. It says that AA is most likely going to become the new standard federally, so I pick that one. Takes you to this screen. You pick which one is a primary, and bang, it takes you to this page, which is great because not only does it show you if it passes or fails an accessibility test for either colorblind or low vision users, but it tells you at what size it fails. So this color combination back here, this black and pink, or whatever you want to call it, is not good for 18-point or smaller. Like a business card, I wouldn't use it. But it's great for huge things like a presentation. It passes just fine. Khan Academy just came out with another cool one. This uses the same rule set as that Chrome extension that I showed earlier, but it's called Totally. And it's a little JavaScript snippet that you put in your website, and then you get this really cool on the left, this like pop-up, and then you can like cycle through things like check my labels, check my alt text, check my headings, and it gives you a bunch of really good information on the right side. So this is brand new. I haven't checked it out much yet, but it looks really great. And then Adi Osmani has a11y on his GitHub. And this is cool because it does a lot of what the other ones did, like the Chrome Element Inspector, but it's a Node app, so you can run it right from the command line. So again, if anybody's thinking automated testing, this is a really good way to go. So I download it, run it against my site. It gives me some red, some green. If I zoom in on the red, it's like the same stuff we've been seeing. I need those labels. This element's obscured by another element. A lot of people ask me about JavaScript frameworks, and particularly JavaScript frameworks that are generating the markup for you, how you would go about doing these things, like ARIA or semantic markup. But a lot of them, in particular that I've seen, React and AngularJS, have really great extensions that help you with that. So for Angular, they have ng ARIA, which is all about getting you that semantically correct ARIA that you need. And then React has React Ally on GitHub here. And this not only does some of that stuff, but it also gives you real-time warnings if you're about to commit some code that has an accessibility flaw in it. So both are really worth checking out if you use those frameworks. As far as like terms to keep in mind for like the groups that are behind accessibility in the web, specifically behind the W3, there's the WAY, the Web Accessibility Initiative, and then WCAG. Those are two terms that'll get thrown around. WCAG is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So just to simplify, WAY is a group of people that publishes WCAG, which is a group of guidelines. And the guidelines are really high level, and I'd really recommend reading them. They even have like an at-a-glance page if you go to the W3 site. It's like the stuff I've been covering, like make sure your site can be used by keyboard, make sure your site can be used by alternate devices, make sure it's not a confusing workflow. These aren't highly technical things. These are just things that will really help a lot of users. A point I really wanted to drive home here as I finish up is that the web is already accessible, even if your website is not accessible. And I don't mean this as an insult at all, it's just a reality. And so if we take the world's first web page, right, published by CERN in like the early 90s, this is a very accessible web page, right? There's no CSS, there's semantic HTML, you can turn on a screen reader and it'll read the differences between those links and those paragraphs great. There's a heading, there's great content here. This is 1991 and this is fantastic, all right? So the reason as developers we should care is because we're the ones making these sites inaccessible with our really cool slideshows and our crazy CSS animations and all this really beautiful stuff we do, which I love. It's great that we do it. But it's kind of like, you know, it's just undoing the damage that you just did to that website. Also, just generally why people should care, it's a human rights issue. It's really important to me, back to that initial definition, that everybody should be able to use the web. That's like what's so beautiful about the web, and that everybody should be able to contribute to it. So making websites that everyone can use and make better is just so core to me of why I'm a web developer. More and more it's becoming a legal issue. We see this a lot in like smartphones or car software where you can get sued for having inaccessible features. And we're seeing it with web stuff in the UK too, where I think the direction things are heading is if you put out one of these big relied upon pieces of software and certain people with certain disabilities can't use it, that just is discriminatory and it is a problem. And I think more and more we're going to see it as a legal issue. And then a huge one too is reaching a larger audience. I mean, the statistics vary, but I've often seen ones that are like 1 in every 5 Americans reports some sort of disability. I mean, we're talking about these like huge numbers of people, these potential users, these potential customers, and it's a real great way to set yourself away from the competition. You know, if you're in an industry and nobody's got very accessible websites, this is like a really, really great thing you can do to get a leg up. So that's it. My last slide is just 3 things you can do right now, 3 takeaways. 1, go audit all of your sites. Pick your poison, whether it's the Chrome or the Firefox or the terminal one. 2, check your color schemes on your business cards. Check them on your website. Check them on your banners, anything like that. And then 3, really join the community. Like I said, there's an unfortunate lack of information right now about accessibility, but the community has been so warm and welcoming. There's a really great Slack channel, a11y, that I'd recommend joining. There's also Accessibility Camp Bay Area, which is where I met a lot of these really great people that are presenting with me tonight. Jennison runs a meetup group for anyone that's from this area. That's an accessibility camp that meets. And the people are just so incredible and so nice, and that's really, really, I think, one of the best things that you can do to start making this whole situation better. And then last, follow me if you want on Twitter at jcoop and ask me any questions. And if I can't answer them, at least I'll be able to point you in the direction of somebody that can. So thanks very much.